has a straight edge on it, so it's very easy. And maybe in our world here, there lives a happy little mountain.
Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Caitlin and I upload a whole bunch of different types of videos on this channel, mainly surrounding true crime videos. I do mysteries, murders, disappearances, psychological experiment videos, and that is what I'm bringing to you today. Before we get on with the video, don't forget to check out all of my social media on the screen. They will also be in the description, as well as a link to a company called BetterHelp. They provide a really fantastic online counselling service that if that's something you have been hoping to look into, then I definitely recommend you checking out the link below because it's fantastic. So today's experiment, little disclaimer, isn't one of these ones where I discuss some sort of harmful, unethical experiment. It was actually suggested by one of you guys, so thank you very much for sending me that message. I had a really lovely chat with you and I love it when you guys send me your requests. So we're going to be talking about the Minnesota starving experiment, which was technically quite controversial and seemingly kind of quite immoral because what the participants had to go through in the name of science was quite drastic, but they were all willing, they all chose, they all knew what they were going to go through, and also a lot of them came out of it saying that they were glad they took part because it contributed such a huge piece of evidence or research to our understanding to this day of the human body and how we deal with certain eating behaviours. A lot of the knowledge from this study has set a basis for a lot of the knowledge we have today on things like eating disorders, so I'll go into a little bit more about it. I just wanted to do this one because when it was suggested, I straight away researched it and I found it really interesting. So I hope you guys find this just as interesting as I do. We shall just get started. Experiment began in November of 1944, so during World War II, when 36 men ended up volunteering to take part in a psychological or just a research study that had hoped to sort of better our understanding of how the human body can process and recover from being starved. So from experiencing starvation, as there were a lot of people around the war times who were suffering from quite extreme starvation, and these experimenters wanted to improve their knowledge just so that they can then apply it, send out help to any relief workers that are working during the years of the war and also after the war to help bring those people back to health again. The experiment required the participants to live full time in the hallways, the corridors, the rooms inside the University of Michigan football stadium. They could do their own thing in the daytime. I'll go into a little bit what their schedules were later, but they technically lived here. They lived in this football stadium, and overall the study lasted for around a year. Participants were selected from the overall volunteer list very carefully. They were very specific about what type of participants they wanted to take part in the study, namely that they couldn't have shown any signs of any previous mental illnesses, anything physical. They also had to be single, which was kind of a big thing that they wanted to focus on. One of the requirements was also that they needed to act well under pressure, to be able to cope under pressure, but also be a great member of a team. They wanted particularly sociable men that would thrive in this group environment. There had initially been 200 volunteers in total, but after this careful selection process of them checking off the things that they required in a participant, they ended up with 36 male volunteers. It is worth noting that the way that they went about advertising for these volunteers is kind of questionable. Some have said that it's slightly immoral, and it did tell them what they would need to do eventually, like they weren't ever kept in the dark, but the way that they kind of gained the initial volunteers' attention, it was a little bit immoral in some senses, or in some people's eyes. So they created this brochure that they handed out to a bunch of people, and across the front of the brochure was a massive photo of children, and then the words written above it were, "Will you starve that they be fed?" So some people have said this is kind of potentially immoral because it's playing on guilt as opposed to just asking for volunteers for a research study. But I don't know, it's kind of it gained their attention, I guess. First point of the study was implemented to almost mimic the perception of starvation. So experimenters asked these participants that they had gathered together and put inside this football stadium to lose 25% of their current body weight. In the first 3 months, they had a very kind of normal diet. So they were told that they had to consume around 3,200 calories per day. Each of the meals in each of these sort of phases that I will go through, bearing in mind, were split over 2 meals, so they only had breakfast and lunch. So yes, in this first stage they had a pretty normal eating routine. Like I said, they were having about 3,200 calories a day, split over 2 meals. Following this, the next 6 months were the starvation phases, so the participants could only eat around 1,570 calories a day across the 2 meals to implement these starving-like conditions. Following this, the 3 months afterwards, they were told to eat between 2,000 and 3,000 calories a day, and then there was an 8-week period where they could eat anything. They had no restrictions on their diet. They could literally do whatever they want because obviously they'd spent the past almost a year starving themselves. The food that made up their diet across these phases, there was a number of different types of things. A lot of it was carbohydrate based because, bearing in mind the time period, there was an abundance of carbs like potatoes and things just available to them, so the actual diet itself was varied to whatever they could get their hands on. In addition to these dietary restrictions, every day they had a full set of routines or activities that they had to complete, and they were a lot. They had to be extremely active throughout the experiment, so this included a couple hours of lab work a day. They also were told that they had to walk at least 22 miles a week, so they could spread this out however they wanted to across each day. But bearing in mind the amount of calories they were consuming, this was extremely exhausting for them. They also had psychologically stimulating activities throughout the week, something they called educational activities, just because the study wanted to look at not only the physical effects of starving, but also the psychological effects. Any and all changes in the participants' behaviours, mental and physical, were recorded so they could kind of examine the differences amongst the different phases. During the 6th month semi-starvation phase in particular was when they noticed the most psychological and physical changes, as you would expect, because they were consuming barely anything and doing a lot of activities. So not only did the men appear smaller and weaker, obviously they lost a lot of weight, they became very frail looking, but they also noticed an extreme deterioration in their abilities to complete any active tasks. So like their stamina reduced, their strength, everything like that. Their physical abilities changed dramatically. Factors like their heart rate and their internal body temperature were drastically changed as well, so it was very clear that the body was particularly unhealthy in each of these men. One of the major psychological effects that was noted by experimenters was that each of the men had a sudden dramatic drop in their sex drive, and this became replaced by an extreme obsession with food. Participants would report having stupidly low attention spans because they couldn't stop themselves from like daydreaming about food, when the next meal was, what they wanted to eat. They literally couldn't focus on anything because all they could think about was food. Along with this, they were particularly aggressive. There was a lot of mood swings, so a lot of them would lash out all of a sudden because obviously they were exhausted. Some of them felt particularly depressed and lonely, so they went through this whole roller coaster of emotions, negative emotions, because this was the body's response to starvation. There was one man in particular who was a participant in this study, and one day he was so exhausted, he'd been chopping wood at his home and he actually ended up cutting off one of his own fingers. And there was an interview he did when he came out of the study. He said that he hadn't been healthy, he wasn't in a great state of mind. He wasn't ready to say that he did it on purpose, but he also couldn't conclusively say that he believed it was a complete accident. He said that like his mental state was just not okay. There were some participants in particular who also associated seeing a full meal, so someone eat a full meal, or if he saw a full meal in front of him, they would feel genuinely guilty and they couldn't eat their entire meal, even if it was reduced calories, like a small plate. They couldn't eat it all because they associated it with feeling guilty, like they shouldn't be eating that much. Experimenters noted some really strange behaviours around food in terms of during the starvation period, when the men would be handed their like meals, they would almost cradle it and pass the plates to each other like it was fragile, and they would like coo at it, they would make all these noises. The experimenters even went as far as likening them to small children playing. Like, they were so obsessed with this food that something about it changed the way they were acting. Men were reported becoming like obsessed over collecting recipes for different food meals. Like, it was really strange. They were collecting these recipes for food they would never even like. They were just obsessed with something to do with food. The closest thing they could get to food was recipes. Some men, even when they were out on their daily activities, tried to steal food, because obviously their meals, their diets were restricted and they were maintained by the experimenters. One man in particular stole coffee cups from a local store. Some participants even took up like other obsessive behaviours, addictions like smoking or chewing gum, because they had to somehow project this obsession with food onto something else to keep them sane. One common behaviour that was shared amongst participants was that they were found to guzzle extreme amounts of water. Like, they were drinking so much water and in such an aggressive manner that it was like they were trying to trick their bodies into thinking that they weren't hungry anymore, because they were technically filling their stomachs. And this was noted amongst like virtually all of the participants. The negative psychological effects even manifested itself into the relationships between not only the participants with other participants, but also the participants in any potential relationships outside of the experiment. So there were men that were falling out and having fights amongst themselves, but also men reported losing any potential new romantic partners. When they'd go out on dates and things, they'd have more arguments because they'd be more irritable, and everything for these men kind of just deteriorated. Experimenters started seeing the majority of the men just didn't want to be in a social environment, which is obviously one of the things that they intentionally looked for in participants. They wanted people who enjoyed being in a group and being sociable, and this changed completely. None of the men wanted to be with anyone, they wanted to be alone, they were happier alone, but they'd also have these extreme mood swings. These extreme conditions ultimately proved too traumatic for 3 participants who were removed from the study because they didn't adhere to the weight loss rules that were required of them. In 1945, the war kind of outside of the experiment ended, but the experiment itself was still in its semi-starvation phase, so experimenters became really concerned that by the time they finished their experiment, it would prove to be pointless, because all the relief workers will have already gone out and tried to help all the starving people, and whatever the results were that came from their experiment, they wouldn't have gotten them in time. So in October of 1945, the experiment ended. The results provided the experimenters with kind of enough knowledge to create this book. It was like a guideline book of how to deal with starvation in the human body, how to help people out of it. So essentially by implementing like a gradual calorie increase, is what they said. This book was called Men and Hunger. It was a lot just from whatever the results they could have gotten from the experiment at that time. It was published, sent out in hopes of helping any potential relief workers, helping all of the many people who were suffering from starvation at the time. One of the really notable effects that was noticed in the experiment that was implemented into the rules that they had written for this guideline book was that in the 8-week period where men were told they could eat anything they want, as much as they want, they were warned at the time to avoid overeating because of the shock to their bodies. But some of the men didn't listen to this. Some of the men just completely went to the extreme and ate a lot. So they were able to compare these results of those who had kind of experienced this unrestricted rehabilitation with the food compared with the people who had this gradual increase in their calories, and they used this comparison to help build these rehabilitation guidelines for those suffering from starvation. The literature that was created from this experiment is still a basic guideline to this day. It is a basis of a lot of our knowledge of the human reaction, the human body reaction to starvation, basically not getting any of the human necessities. And it took the participants months, some even years, to get their bodies back to its full healthy self. Even mentally, it took them a long time to get over what they had experienced. Not necessarily the trauma that the actual experimenters put them through, because they didn't. It was just this kind of depression, this low mood, this very unhealthy way of mind. However, this might seem really strange to some of you, but like I said in the intro, the participants who took part in this study all claim that they are glad they took part in it, because it brings us so much information about disordered eating and how the body reacts to it both physically and mentally. And like I said in the intro, it kind of provides so much understanding for us about mental health disorders, eating disorders, and how this can have such a negative effect on you both mentally and physically. I found this so fascinating because it's one of the most obvious results, one of the most obvious signs, unhealthy mind and unhealthy body because of this disordered eating, and I found that absolutely fascinating. So I hope you guys found this interesting. Let me know down below if there are any videos you want me to discuss in future weeks' videos. I love hearing your guys' requests, but also your discussions on whatever case I have covered in that video. Like I said, check out the description. There'll be all of my social medias there, as well as a link to BetterHelp, the online counselling service. And yes, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found it interesting, and I will see you guys soon for another video. Bye.